Hey guys, this is your ecology review for your upcoming assessment. So biotic and abiotic factors are living and non-living factors in an ecosystem, such as plants, animal, and fungi for living, and the non-living components would be water, sunlight, soil, air, and temperature. The interacting biotic and abiotic components make up ecosystems, and the organisms that feed in an ecosystem make up a food chain, and they show that feeding from the smallest to the largest organisms. A food web is interacting food chains. And in this pond ecosystem, you can see that it starts with these diatoms, which are phytoplankton that are fed on by zooplankton and larger fish, all the way up to these large predatory birds. An ecological pyramid shows the energy transfer between different trophic levels. So you've got plants on the bottom followed by herbivores, and then either primary carnivores, or omnivores. And then at the very top level, you would have tertiary consumers or secondary level carnivores. And then at the very, very top, you might have tertiary carnivores. So only 10% of energy is transferred from one level to the next, and that's because the components that make us up are not always easily digestible and then transferred into energy. For example, hairs, bones, teeth, nails, claws, things like that. They take a lot of energy to grow, but they are not transferred into energy that's digestible. So plants also have components that are not easily digestible, like the bark and the roots of trees. Ecological pyramids have different names, and so I've talked about producers and autotrophs, which are the plants on the bottom. And if they're fed on directly by organisms, we would call those organisms herbivores. They can also be referred to as primary consumers. Now, if the next level are predatory and they're carnivores, we would call them the primary carnivores. We can also refer to them as secondary consumers. And then the next level would be the secondary carnivores or the tertiary consumers. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration are the two cycles on Earth that drive energy. Plants take in sun's light energy and utilize chloroplasts in their cells to take in carbon dioxide, water, and produce glucose and oxygen, which is C6H12O6, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and oxygen. So that molecule of glucose is what we take in when we eat food. We either eat vegetables and plants or animals that eat plants. So vegetables, fruits, nuts, berries, meat, cheeses, dairy, all that food we break down into this one molecule called glucose, C6H12O6. And then in our cells, we take that and that and oxygen, and we produce carbon dioxide and water. And these two cycles are the reverse. So if you look at the products of photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen, they're the reactants in cellular respiration. And the same for photosynthesis. The reactants in photosynthesis are the products in cellular respiration. So we could look at these two these two equations and refer to them as a cycle that drive the energy on Earth. So plants depend on us and we depend on them. So the carbon cycle has lots of different ways that you can look at it. And one of the things, in addition to the things I've just talked about, is the burning of fossil fuels. So since the Industrial Revolution, we've increased our burning of fossil fuels and wood, which has added carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. So normally that carbon dioxide would be taken in by plants, and then we would utilize that in the process of cellular respiration when we eat plants and animals that eat plants. But the problem is that in the last century, we've increased the burning of these fossil fuels and of wood that's adding more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than the plants can take in. And so that's leading to climate change because we have excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that carbon dioxide layer adds this effect we call the greenhouse effect. And if you look at the time since the 1880s, you can see this white line represents the carbon dioxide concentration and how it's growing, and the corresponding elevation in temperature over the last century. The phosphorus cycle is another very important cycle because it's one of the things that plants love. It's like the pizza for plants. So is nitrogen. But this is a image of the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is extracted from mines. It can also be a component of runoff when rocks erode, and then it's transported through tributaries into bodies of water. And once it dissolves, plants love it. They use it to grow, and you can have algae take it in, and then those photosynthetic organisms can bloom. And what can happen is they can almost take over an aquatic area. And we can see this sometimes in the meadows when we have too much fertilizer runoff because there's a lot of phosphates in fertilizer. But agricultural areas will see this as well. So if you've ever seen areas that look like this is a bad image, but really green algae that's growing, that's called eutrophication. So like I said, fertilizer runoff, it just runs into these bodies of water, and then it blocks the sunlight from penetrating down below the layers of the water. Eventually, the algae, after it blooms, it dies, and then you have bacteria that feed on it, and they require a lot of oxygen, so they take the oxygen out of the water, and you have a fish kill. Here's another thing, or another way it might look. You might have this excessive green and then a fish kill. So this is hypoxia due to eutrophication. The reason this is important is because these wetlands provide lots of services. We call them ecosystem services. And a healthy pond or wetland provides services that we could never pay for, such as they provide habitat and biodiversity, recreation. They regulate those nutrients I was just talking about, like nitrogen and phosphorus. They regulate soil and sediment that might be running off from construction areas. They regulate disturbances from natural hazards like tornadoes, cyclones, hurricanes, things like that. They give us aesthetic value, which is just beauty. Sometimes we like to be there, swimming, boating, fishing. They provide clean water because they act as a filter to pollutants. They can provide food, so we say they're very productive and that there's a lot of photosynthesis going on there. And it's food for animals, but it's also food for us. Some of the areas of ponds or lake that are really important is the littoral and the limnetic zone. So knowing what these are is important for you. The littoral zone is the area where you have emergent plants. So you can see these cattails and these other reeds and sedges that are emerging from the water. And then it transitions as the water gets deeper to these floating plants and then submergent plants in the limnetic zone. And then the light zones are differentiated between photic and aphotic. Photic means that light can penetrate, and this is where the most of your productivity and photosynthesis would be going on with your algae. But the aphotic would be an area where light would not be able to penetrate because it's too deep. So why can fish survive the winter, and what is thermal stratification of a lake? So you've got the epilimnion, the thermocline, and the hypolimnion. We also call the thermocline the metalimnion. So the epilimnion is the upper layers. If you went to Chatfield, you'd be swimming in the epilimnion. You can dive down and feel colder layers, and sometimes you might be hitting that metalimnion layer. But I want you to look at the degrees. So you've got 20 degrees all the way down to 4 degrees. Notice and remember that 4 degrees is the lowest temperature here in the summer. As we move into fall, which we just are coming out of or at the end of, we have what's called the fall overturn. And if you notice, all the temperatures now are 4 degrees. So Chatfield would be at this place almost probably at 4 degrees. Typically we'd be a little bit colder, but we've had a very warm fall. And then from this fall, you move into winter where the top starts to ice over from the shore to the middle. And if it's frozen, it's 0 degrees. Below it is 2 degrees, all the way down to 3 and then 4 degrees at the very bottom. And then in the spring, when this ice starts to melt off as the days get longer and the temperatures warm up, you have the spring overturn. And then eventually, as it continues to get warmer and the days get even longer, you have summer where you're back to the epilimnion, the thermocline, and the hypolimnion. So you can see that this is a cycle, and these are the different thermal layers or thermal stratification of a lake. But what's really important is that this is the reason that fish can overwinter. That means that they can survive through the winter because the temperature is always 4 degrees at the very bottom. And so even in the winter, they will go down there and hang out and they won't freeze. Only the top layers of the lake have frozen at 0 degrees. So, what are the levels of ecological organization on Earth? And so, if you were to look at every single biome on Earth, they're broken up into ecosystems. And we study ecosystems based on the individuals or the species in that ecosystem that make up populations, the populations that make up the communities that make up the ecosystems that make up the different biosphere, and the biosphere that makes, or the biomes that make up the biosphere. And species in these ecosystems interact in different ways. And there's 5 major types of symbiotic relationships or interactions. One is called predation, where one animal feeds on another or preys on it. Parasitism is when you've got an animal that's acting like a parasite. Its intention is not to kill, but to weaken its host. If it kills it, it's not an advantage. So parasites do not intend to kill, just to weaken. Competition is when 2 organisms compete for the same resource. Mutualism is when 2 organisms come together and they both benefit. And then commensalism is when 2 organisms come together and one benefits and the other is neither benefited nor harmed. So you could look at this cow and this egret, and they're probably hanging out in a prairie, and the bird is feeding on the bugs or the insects on the hide of the cow, and so the bird is getting fed and the cow is getting cleaned. So that would be a mutualistic relationship. A tick would be an example of a parasite right here. These 2 are fighting, so that would be competition. And then this is predation, one feeding on another. And then we've got a hummingbird and a flower. So the hummingbird is getting food, and the flower is not benefiting. Now, I would kind of beg to differ. If pollen gets on the beak of that hummer and it goes to another flower, then it would actually be mutualism. But they're using this as a commensalistic example in this situation. Carrying capacity is the total number of organisms that can exist in an ecosystem at one time. And what happens with populations is that usually their population will grow very slow, and then all of a sudden resources will become available. Maybe it's lots of rain that creates this abundant vegetation in the spring, and you have this exponential growth phase. And then it starts to slow down as it's nearing carrying capacity. And then once it reaches carrying capacity, the births and the deaths equal each other, and then the population stabilizes. So this is carrying capacity. You'll oftentimes see it as a straight line, but what it really means is that births and deaths equal each other. So some things that can limit population size, we call those limiting factors. And we've got density-dependent limiting factors like food, water, shelter, and space. Other things can be competition, predation, parasitism, and disease. And we have density-independent factors like fires, tornadoes, heavy snows, flooding, and earthquakes. Any kind of natural disaster or unusual weather. So density-dependent means that the population of the organisms is dependent on whatever this factor is. Whereas density-independent, it doesn't matter how many there are, they're all going to die. So these, when we say that populations are regulated, that just means what are some factors that actually cause numbers of that particular species to decline or die. And so these would be the density dependent and these would be the density independent. All organisms have what we call zones of tolerance. And so I like this image because this shows you steelhead trout. And if you look at this graph, here's the lower limit and here's the upper limit. And here's the optimum zone. And so we're talking about the number of steelhead trout that can tolerate certain temperature degrees. So for certain temperatures, so you have 9 degrees Celsius, 13 degrees, 21, and 25. So if we were to say or ask the question, what is the most optimum zone for steelhead to reproduce and survive, we would say about 17 degrees, in between 13 and 21. And then anything below 13, you're getting into the zone of physiological stress. That just means the temperature is so cold that it's becoming harder for them to survive. And look at how your numbers have dropped. And then the zone of intolerance is 9 degrees or less. Same goes for the opposite side, where you have 21 degrees. That's the zone of physiological stress. And then 25 degrees, they cannot survive. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about temperature, pH, oxygen. All organisms have zones of tolerance. If you think about humans and you plopped us in the Arctic at the North Pole, we would have some zones of tolerance with regard to temperature. It'd be difficult for us to survive. That's it, guys.